In this video, we're going to cover looking at understanding the progeny information that's available on performance records. Sometimes questions come up of what information is on the performance records for progeny and what isn't there. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into understanding really what's there and a little bit about what's not there. So there's a lot of information available on registered Angus cattle. One of the most popular features that we have on the American Angus Association website is the EPD Pedigree Lookup feature. Any registered animal with a registration number can be searched to see who owns that animal. Does that animal have genomically enhanced EPDs? What's the pedigree of that animal? Take a look at the EPDs, the progeny counts for each trait, things like accuracies and dollar values. There's a lot of information that's out there and available for any registered Angus animal. Today, though, we're really going to focus in on that progeny piece of information that's out there. But before we do that, I think it's important to take a step back and talk just a little bit about EPDs. Because our EPDs combine multiple sources of information into one number to make selection decisions. So the EPDs that we see will include information about the pedigree and those relationships that are enhanced by genomics. It also includes performance information from that individual animal, as well as progeny data once that animal has progeny. So today we're going to focus in on one component of EPDs, and that's that progeny data piece. But keep in mind that as you're making selection decisions, the power of the EPD comes from the combination of all of these components, and not just focusing in on one piece of it. So the questions that we're going to take a look at answering to start off with are, what are performance records and where are they found? So we can find the progeny performance information both on the performance registration paper as well as on the performance pedigree. Highlighted in the green box on each is the section that we're really going to take a deep dive into today. We're specifically going to look at the performance pedigree portion of that box. You'll notice there's a lot of similarities and some differences between these two pieces of paper, right? So our performance registration paper is that actual registration paper, and our performance pedigree has a lot of the same information, but it's not the true registration paper. So if we hone in really on that box that was highlighted and we look at those various traits, you'll notice that there's 12 traits that are included for each animal. So these traits range from things like birth weight and weaning weight and yearling weight, all the way to things like carcass ultrasound records. Now, depending on the trait will depend on what is the information underneath of it. So each trait has two columns, and that information could include things like how many herds does that animal have progeny in, or how many progeny does that animal have. Could also include things like that animal's ratio for something like birth weight, or it could be the average ratio of his progeny. And we'll take a closer look at that line by line. So for each animal, it includes their own record. So this particular animal for birth weight, we can see that in its contemporary group at birth, it had 163 contemporaries, and this particular animal ratioed 121 for birth, or 21% above the average of its birth contemporary group. Also included is the animal's progeny's performance. So how did that animal's progeny perform? In this particular example, we can see that this sire had 13,743 progeny, represented in 1,481 herds. On average, his progeny were ratioing 102 at birth. We can also take a look at a sire's progeny performance. So the animal that we're looking at, how did his sire's calves perform? We can also see how his dam's progeny performed. And then we can also take a look at the maternal grandsire's progeny's performance. So we take a step back in that pedigree, look at sire, dam, and the maternal grandsire on the performance pedigree. Also included at the bottom is a legend for calving ease. You note that there's calving ease included both in the production and maternal sections of this. We do have the legend down there where it's a categorical trait and it's different than the others. Before we get too deep into understanding what all the data is that's in that performance pedigree, I want to take a step back and really look at what's the history of the performance pedigree and what's the value of this. Well, to give a little bit of perspective, when performance pedigrees were developed, they were really the method to have the most up-to-date information for progeny. So let's say, for example, you're looking at a sire to breed to your cows, and you're wanting the most up-to-date information that you could get at the time, and that was through a performance pedigree. So you would order one, see how his progeny are performing. And you may be asking yourself, well, why wouldn't you just go to EPD Pedigree Lookup? Well, at the time, the National Cattle Evaluation was done on a biannual basis, right? So twice a year, the evaluation was completed, and so then you would have updated EPDs. But between those times, how did you have the most up-to-date information for a sire or a dam? It would be through ordering a performance pedigree. Today, however, things have changed a little bit as technology has advanced. And now we have the evaluation completed 52 times a year. So each week we have an update to the National Cattle Evaluation, and so we're able to have the most up-to-date information for selection for any registered Angus animal on a weekly basis. The other caveat to this is that there's more information available with AAA login through a member's account, as well as the EPD Pedigree Lookup feature. Like we started with, there's a lot of information available on that EPD Pedigree Lookup feature. And so with having more information available, the value of the performance pedigree has changed over time. Now, as we really dig into what information is included on the performance pedigree, well, as we look across there, it's important to understand that all of the traits that are on here, with one exception, they're all continuous and they have normally distributed data. So what does that really mean? Well, we're going to dig into that more in just a second, but I want you to keep that in mind because it's important to understand that as we talk about what information is included. Things like ratios and how we calculate those. Having continuous and normally distributed data is a key component of that. So let's dig in a little bit more. Continuous versus categorical. So our continuous traits, those that I just had highlighted, things like our weights, something like ribeye area or scrotal circumference. These are things that they're typically numerical values that we're measuring. So animal gets on a scale, you record the weight, that's a numerical value that you're recording. The other key component of this is that these are going to be normally distributed. We're going to talk more about that and take a look at a couple of examples of what that really means. The other kind of data that we often see are these categorical type data. So it is exactly what it says. It's categories of data. So think about something like a body condition score. This will range anywhere from a 1 to a 9. So if you're assigning body condition scores, a cow can have 1 of 9 scores. Essentially, she falls into 1 of 9 buckets, right? She could have a body condition score of 1, or 2, or 3, or 4, or so on. And so we have categories of data, and so it's not continuous. Another way to look at this is to take an example of gender. Whenever you register an animal, it can be one of 3 genders. It could be a bull, a cow, or a steer. So it falls into 1 of 3 categories, and that's how categorical data is described. And a little difference with categorical data is that these often have a skewed distribution, and we'll take a look at that in more detail. So going back to our continuous data, again, things like our weights or heights or ribeye area. These are going to be the continuous, normally distributed data. And what we mean by that is that in this graph that I have here, we can see that on our y-axis we have our frequencies ranging from 0 up to 120, and across the bottom where you would typically see weights, I've put in a 0 and then 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, or 3 standard deviations away from the mean. So what we see with normally distributed data is that we see most of those values are going to be there towards the center. There where I have the line is the average or the mean of the group. From there, we start to see this bell-shaped curve go out. So each side of the mean looks similar. So we have about the same number on each side. Most are clustered there towards the middle within 1 standard deviation. And as we move out, it stair steps down in terms of the number of observations that we see there. So that's a normal distribution, and that's really important as we get closer to talking about ratios. Now, as we look at categorical data, we often see a skewed distribution. So again, these are things like gender or body condition score, or even hair shedding scores. So for something like hair shedding, an animal can receive 1 of 5 scores, either a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. They will fall into one of those 5 buckets. So what you notice right away is that the average, or where we see most of those scores, it's not in the center. And so either side of that average doesn't look the same, right? So we have a longer tail of that distribution on one side than the other, and that creates problems as we start trying to think about how we calculate ratios. And so categorical data that's not normally distributed has some challenges in terms of how we use it or how we don't use it. So the question comes up, okay, what information is really included? And we're going to dive deeper now into these ratios and how we calculate those ratios. Because again, for the most part, with one exception, all of these traits are continuous and normally distributed. So let's change gears just a little bit and think about our trait ratios. So you're all very aware, a ratio is really just looking at the animal's individual performance compared to the average of the group, okay? And so these trait ratios, they have value within the contemporary group or within a herd, but where we're comparing relative performance, that's the extent of really where ratios go. It's also important to understand that ratios were derived and based on the assumption of a normal distribution. So think back to what we just saw with something like weaning weight. We saw that normal distribution, most were clustered towards the center, compared to something like the hair shedding score, where we had that skewed distribution. As we look through the equation for calculating a ratio, it's really pretty straightforward in terms of how to calculate a basic ratio. Again, it's just comparing the animal's individual performance relative to the average of the contemporary group. So the information that we need is the performance of the individual, and then the average performance of the contemporary group. Divide those and multiply by 100 to get our ratio. So let's look at that in terms of a couple of examples. Let's say we have 10 bull calves and they average 600 pounds adjusted weaning weight. One particular bull in that group, bull 123, weighed 630 pounds adjusted weaning weight. Again, we look at the equation. We take his individual weight, 630 pounds, and divide it by the average, 600 pounds. Multiply that by 100, and we get to 105. So bull 123 would have had a 105 weaning weight ratio, or 5% greater than the group average. If we look at another example here, we have the same 10 bull calves, and they average 600 pounds, again adjusted at weaning. Now bull 321 weighed 570 pounds adjusted weaning weight. If we take his individual weight, 570 pounds, and divide it by the group average of 600, multiply by 100, we get 95. And so this particular calf would have ratioed 95 at weaning and had a 5% less than group average weaning weight. All right, so having a concept of how to calculate a basic trait ratio, let's look at the differences of if we have something like weaning weight that's a continuous trait versus, say, a categorical trait, and how that has an effect on ratios. So just as a reminder, our weaning weights are collected between 120 and 280 days of age. And to be eligible for the same contemporary group, a group of calves need to be weighed within a 3-day window in order to be able to be in the same group. So as we walk through this example, we're taking a look at one contemporary group, and this particular group had an average weaning weight of 431 pounds. It ranged from 302 pounds up to the heaviest calf of 550. So if you look below, you'll notice that we have that normal distribution. We see that bell-shaped curve. Most of those animals weigh towards the middle of the group, and we have fewer out at either end. Now thinking about our ratios, the way ratios are designed is that average in any group is always going to be 100. And so our average ratio for this group is 100, with the minimum ratio being 70 up to a maximum ratio of 128. So if we look at individual animals in this group, looking over at this chart, if we look at animal A, we'll see that this particular animal was the lightest calf in the group and weighed 302 pounds. We divide it by the group average of 431, and we get to a ratio of 70. We look at animal D. He had a weight of 416 pounds. Again, divide it by the group average. He was closer to that group average, and so he would have ratioed 97 pounds, or ratioed 97 at weaning. So as we continue on and we look down here, an animal like H would have weighed 508 pounds at weaning, and then ratioed 118, or 18% above that average. So whenever we have a normal distribution, it's a continuous trait, we're able to see ratios are logical, they make sense, and the data works well with the equation and the assumption of the equations. So what do these ratios really tell us? Well, we had the normal distribution, we had continuous data, and so it tells us the relative performance within that group, right? We can compare these animals within their group and know how they performed. Now, if we switch gears a little bit, and now we look at a categorical trait, something like docility, it's going to look a little different. Again, keeping in mind that this is a categorical trait, so it's not the continuous data, but reminder that docility should be recorded at the yearling age window, and that it's going to be scored on a 1 to 6 scale. So 1 representing docile to 6 representing very aggressive. I think it's also important here to understand that it doesn't matter if we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 in front of those descriptions. If we had an A, B, C, D, E, F, it would represent the same thing. We're just using those numbers to represent their descriptions. So keep that in mind as we move through this. As we take a look at this group would have averaged 2.1 for their docility score. Again, keeping in mind to calculate a ratio, we need a group average to be able to compare animals to. Minimum in this group would have been a score of 1, and the maximum was a score of 6. So the whole scale was used in this particular group for docility. Again, ratios are designed that average is always 100, and so we see a minimum ratio in this group of 47 up to 280. You'll notice in the distribution down below, again, we don't have that normal distribution, we see a skewed distribution, where more of the animals are there towards that score of 2. Now, as we look at individual animals in this group and the relative ratios going with each individual score, what you notice right off is that each score is going to receive the same value, right? So a score of 1, every animal that scores a 1 for docility in this group, ratio is a 47. Every animal that scores a 2, ratio is a 93. Now what you'll notice here is that we don't have any animal actually ratioing 100. Again, where we have categorical traits, they have to receive a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. There's no half scores, there's no in-between scores. And so the actual average, if it has a decimal, there will be no animals receiving that average score. So if we look at something, say, for example, in this group, an animal that scored a 5 for docility, their ratio goes up to 234 because the average was 2.1. So what we see whenever we're using these categorical traits with a skewed distribution is that it doesn't always make sense in terms of the ratios that we're getting back. The information doesn't add value to what we already know. So this brings us back to the question of, well, what do the ratios tell us? Well, we had a skewed distribution and we had categorical data. So we didn't meet the assumptions of the assumptions to calculate a ratio. So really these ratios don't tell us a whole lot and they don't add a lot of value. Let's take a look at one more example quick. If we look at hair shed again, another categorical trait. This particular trait is scored at the yearling age window or older, and it's scored whenever there's variation in shedding in the herd. And each animal can be scored on an annual basis. But again, we're scoring on a scale. So it's a 1 to 5 scale, 1 representing 100% of that winter hair coat has been shed out, all the way down to a 5 where all of the winter hair coat is still remaining. So if we look at this example, again, looking at one contemporary group, the average of this particular contemporary group for hair shedding is a 2.4. So we use the whole scale, a minimum score of 1 up to a maximum score of 5. And again, we see that ratio averaging at 100. So our minimum score is our minimum ratio is 42 and our maximum ratio is 208. We look again at the individual animals in the group. Animal A and B both scored a 1, and so we're going to see that minimum ratio of a 42 there. If we look at the N and we look at J and K that both scored a 5 for hair shedding, we see that ratio of a 208. So again, with using categorical data, skewed distributions, we start to see these extreme values that are really nonsensical. So again, what do these ratios tell us whenever we have categorical data? Well, we've got a skewed distribution, categorical data. So again, it comes back to not a whole lot, and it doesn't really add value. So understanding what is on the performance pedigree may ask the question of, well, how do I order a performance pedigree? If you navigate to AAA login, go to My Herd, the Animal Miscellaneous folder, and go to Purchase an Angus Performance Pedigree, It'll bring you to this screen. You can enter in the registration number of an animal you'd like to purchase the pedigree for. It's $2 per animal, and then click Save. From there, you'll navigate to your checkout cart, check out your cart, and then you'll receive an email once your request is ready to view. Once you receive the email, you'll navigate back to AAA login, go to My Herd, Animal Miscellaneous, and then view your purchased performance pedigrees. From there, you'll see the animals that you purchased. You'll be able to click on them and view them, and you have 14 days to be able to view those performance pedigrees. This is an example of what the performance pedigree that you would see looks like. And if you have any questions, contact the Performance Programs Department at 816-383-5100 or angus@angus.org.